It's the Future Perfect Book Club.
We're back. Another episode. Who knew? We're real. We're official.
I'm Joel Goodman.
I'm Ron Bronson.
And we're reading Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist by Liz Pelly. Liz is a writer and editor based in New York, and Mood Machine is her first book. Ron, tell us about the book. Give us a short synopsis.
A short synopsis is we're talking about Spotify, how it's evil.
It's true. So let's just start off here. Did you like the book?
There was a lot that I liked. But the things I really enjoyed weren't so much about the deep dives into Spotify, which is a lot of stuff that had been covered before and I knew about. It was actually learning about all the sort of historical connection type things that were interesting to me. Reading about Thomas Edison, learning about the history of music, learning about some of the sort of older payola stuff in radio versus what's going on now. All that stuff really appealed to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, in general, I thought it was a very good book by someone who's clearly a journalist and a writer.
Yeah.
I thought on balance, it was a good book.
For me, same. Thumbs up. I enjoyed 95% of it. I wish there were more solutions, but it's really hard when you're in the middle of writing something that's happening right now and you're seeing all the effects. But same as you, I knew a lot of the algorithmic stuff that was happening, but it was the little details that came up around the history, like you said, also even the history of Spotify in terms of the products that they have acquired and how that affected other products that we loved, which I'm sure we'll talk about. It was interesting to see this topic of kind of algorithmic control being applied in a different sort of way, in a different sort of medium. So yeah, Ron, let's dive in. Let's talk about some of this. Let's dig into some of the themes. Was there anything that surprised you? And if not, because I don't think a lot of this was surprising, what do you think was the most, and I guess the most important thing, or especially with all the stuff that you're thinking about and working through right now?
I think that, we're music fans. One of the reasons we became good friends is we both bond over music. And I think that if you think about the sort of lineage of music in the streaming era, so talking about early 2000s, I remember being able to use Audio Galaxy to get MP3s. I would leave it on for hours to get one song, through the Zoom Pass era, through where we got Rhapsody. I mean, every streaming service I've used it. And all of those were pretty organically designed, MySpace, designed for you to really immerse yourself more into music. And I feel like the Spotify era started perhaps that way, but then it's evolved into this really terrible, how do I create more engagement through things like fake music, fake artists, that stuff was really the stuff that really I found the most horrifying is this idea that you could create fake artists that are on Spotify so that you can keep the money within Spotify and not pay royalties to actual artists. I mean, it breaks my brain in terms of the incentives, the silliness of it all. And yeah, so that part for me for sure was, I thought, the most interesting, but also the most horrifying part of this book.
I'm with you on that. I think it was interesting to consider kind of the birth of Spotify and what it was meant to do, which I think, to your point, a lot of people think that the marketing is the reality, that it was really meant to be this thing that's democratizing access to music and is making sure that artists get paid more and that there's more discoverability. But you find out through this, and I mean through a lot of reporting over the years, that the guys that started Spotify were ad men. They were looking at ways to monetize. And I think what was super surprising to me within this, along the lines of what you're saying, is just how derivative Spotify actually is. It was revolutionary sort of, but mostly because there was such a long gap between music's dominance of kind of public space music or functional music, as Liz talks about it a lot, and less about it being a completely new idea. Because you allude to this in the intro, this all started out actually with Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph and then eventually spun off a whole record distribution arm, which I had no idea about. That was really,
I had no idea either. That was fascinating to me. I had no idea.
With all of this talk and research into how you can control listener behavior, control people's behavior. I mean, they put it in terms of affecting mood. So you want people to be happier. So how do you do it? All of that's really 1984 dystopian Brave New World type of shit, That's not it can sound nice, but it's kind of scary.
Yeah, I just, and I think the gig is up now in terms of hiding it, right? And for a long time, they sort of were able to sort of hide it. And people were raising the alarm very early. Hey, we make no money on Spotify, you know, and maybe you make that trade off because of the visibility and the marketability of
Yeah.
being able to be in a platform that allows you to get some eyeballs you wouldn't get. I found lots of artists on Spotify, but I didn't find them through the curation of Spotify. It was a sort of a combination of the algorithm, though less so now. And but more importantly, this idea that people would create playlists. And because of all these user generated playlists, that allowed you to find stuff you wouldn't find. Because for a long time, like Danger Mouse, the guy who was half of Gnarls Barkley, had a Spotify playlist he updated regularly. Questlove from The Roots had a
Yeah.
Spotify playlist he would update regularly. Like, I thought this was the coolest thing that people I know only know them from their playlists on Spotify that I met on Twitter years ago. And there were so many really good ones, some still updated. But because now, of course, everything is algorithmic slop, what you end up having is a playlist that I've listened to for years. And because I can't get a good shuffle on it, it plays the same songs over and over again
Yeah.
because this person's paid Spotify some money.
Yeah.
And so now, because you and I use Last FM, shout out to Last FM. I remember there was an artist, his name was like Saha Baby or something. I don't know. He's like a rapper or something. I definitely have never intentionally ever listened to one of his songs. But because he was on some weird payola playlist that I listened to, it kept playing his songs.
Yeah.
So I had to go to the Last FM and delete every mention of him, and then I had to block him on Spotify. They stopped putting his songs in my playlists because I didn't want to hear it. It just, what it does to music listening really, really, really is
Yeah.
problematic. It's really problematic. And it's something that if you're a passive music listener, even if you're a big music listening fan, it wouldn't occur to you that is happening in real time.
And I mean, I think this is really personal to both of us too, because we kind of bonded over playlists. We both have history with doing that. Like, shout out to Audio Galaxy, because like that's like a super niche file sharing platform that a lot of people are like, huh? And just one of those other weird crossovers that you and I have in our shared entertainment history. But like the art of the mixtape goes back decades, generations. And I approach it a little bit differently, but I think like in the olden days of our combined favorite streaming service, RIP Rdio, that was the coolest part for me. Sure, I could like find stuff, and I thought their like discovery and their playlist generation stuff was really good. Then Spotify bought the company that did that stuff. It was even better when you could see what your friends were listening to and then just follow their playlists all the time. And those are features that Spotify eventually ripped off and put into their much worse user experience and much worse platform. But maybe it's, Ron, maybe it's better that the RDO got purchased by Pandora, because maybe it would have gone the same way. And I like having that moment in time where it was, unbastardized and just purely a great product. But my old school way of doing mixtapes was, you're a lot more intentional. I was always the toss a bunch of albums that I like into a playlist and then just hit shuffle. It's like I've got some seasonal playlists in quotes on Spotify where it'll be like winter, and I'll just throw a bunch of albums on there that I think are winter albums that kind of have that mood, and then I toss it on shuffle in the car and listen to it. And I think that that's kind of like the hybrid method of how a lot of people listen to music these days, or at least a lot of the mainstream listener base listens. And maybe that's why Spotify was like, we could start to game this. Like, we could really get in, and these people aren't really paying attention to what they're listening to. Maybe we could just shove some of our own stuff in here and pay fewer royalties out to people.
You still can follow what your friends are listening to, but you have to only use the desktop app, and it shows up on the side bar. But they definitely hit it, and it definitely doesn't work the same way. And you also, there's no way to message music to people. For a long time, you could send things within Spotify to someone. You haven't been able to do that for years. On RDIO, our favorite streaming app, that RIP, I remember years ago when Twitter was still a thing, I remember tweeting about it, and I would do it all the time. And I think one time I mentioned something like, we really all miss radio, but we realized that had that site still existed, there's no way that it would have made it through this era, because the beauty of RDIO was that it had groups, and you could comment on records. And this is all pre like spamming everything, and certainly pre-algorithmic anything. And so I remember someone who had worked there responded and said, yeah, you're right. We talked about that we knew that eventually you're going to get comment spam to death on some of these records or, whatever. And so we knew that those features weren't going to be able to sustain themselves long term. So your thought process is right. And I'm like, well, that's good. But you're right. I'm glad we had that. But I think what that site did, I think speaking from both of us as designers and talking about it from a craft perspective,
Yeah.
for people that are out there and you listen to this and you're a builder of something, know that even if your thing didn't last forever, that if you build something with care and intention, that people appreciate that there's still value in that, even if it doesn't last forever. Sometimes just having that moment when you made your Flappy Bird and everyone played it for a while and they had a really good time, like that's okay. Sometimes everything can't last forever.
I think the fact that kind of central unit where, it was groups, I think like on RDO, it was really about people. It was about the people that you were listening to music alongside of. It was personal too, but they weren't just pushing genre or mood or whatever. Spotify shifted that into something that, you're listening to playlists that were created by people you don't know. And curation, sure. If you knew the people, cool. But like all the stuff they were pushing at users and subscribers was their own stuff, all this, like the title of the book, all this mood centric playlist type of stuff. And on page 3 of the book, there's a short little quote that says, playlists don't just respond to users' musical interests, but manufacture them at the same time. That's what Spotify started doing with that. And it opened up that whole, resurgence of payola, basically. And what's interesting there is that it turns into this thing where passive listening isn't something that you just like to do and can continue doing. It turns into something that's actually kind of dangerous in a way, where you don't really know what's coming up. Like you were talking about that artist just showing up and having to block him on Last FM so he doesn't show up. That's the sort of stuff that's really interesting to me. Ron, what's payola? This is an old term.
Yeah, this is definitely an ancient term. In the 60s or the 50s, you had radio stations would basically get paid to play certain songs from record labels. And so you had entire labels doing this, giving money to stations to make sure that they could amplify or boost certain artists' songs.
And that sounds a lot like Spotify.
It is very in line with what is happening now. Payola is the kind of thing that was very open in the 60s and that you knew it was happening. And then by the 80s, we had denied like it was not happening anymore.
Yeah.
Like, oh, no one's doing that. No one. Of
course not.
I've never seen anybody accept any money from anybody. But of course, it was still happening.
Yeah.
Until radio became a less dominant form. Spotify streaming is the radio now.
Yeah.
We talk about Apple Music playlists and all these things that people put to the charts of, was number one on Amazon, whatever that means. So, streaming is the new radio now.
It totally is. And radio for a long time was that sort of functional music. And it just, you turn it on and put it in the background. And there's probably a generational gap and probably a level of fandom gap maybe. And it's kind of interesting to me. Like one of the things she talks about is sort of this difference between function and fandom. And I think that the differentiation for someone like you or me, and a lot of our friends, is that we will, even if we were listening to radio, or even if we're listening to something a little bit more passively, I'm not listening to Spotify, I'm listening to Apple Music. But if I'm shuffling through something or have like the generative radio on, like I'm kind of paying attention. If something piques my interest, I'm going to like go and look up what it is and go and find it. Or even if I'm sitting in a brewery or bar somewhere, like the same sort of thing, I'm going to do a Shazam style thing and scrabble it. But if we take like the definition of functional music that came from Edison through to Muzak and now into like Spotify, there's this difference that Liz calls out, and I think there's actually a term from Spotify. It's lean back music versus lean in music, right? And they're counting on people that are listening to not actually be listening. They're counting on them to just be hearing the music that's there, but not actually listening to it. One of the more interesting stories that I found was how the whole lo-fi genre started out as this like super vibrant online community and forums of people just sharing beats back and forth and making their music together. And then eventually it just descended into this functional music that was co-opted and homogenized by Spotify and by certain labels that were just trying to make this music that they saw was popular on Spotify and was making decent money through the streams that it was getting, and is getting a lot of placement on these playlists by the Spotify staff. And why that's interesting to me is that I have so many friends that talk about how much they're really into lo-fi beats, especially when they're working. It helps them focus and that sort of thing. And it just kind of like proves the point. Like, I mean, you can kind of like an overall vibe of a certain genre, right? But at what point does that just become music that you're a fan of the genre, you're not actually a fan of the musician or a fan of the actual band or whoever it is. Like, one of the quotes that really stuck with me is that algorithmic stuff doesn't create fans. I don't know where that line is on fandom, I guess. Like, we've talked about some of this offline, but there's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, what do you think? Like, in this case, like, the artists became de-emphasized in favor of their labels and in favor of the actual sound that they were making. How do you reconcile that? I mean, I don't reconcile it, but like, what are your thoughts on that, Ron?
I think I've come a long way on this because I was pro-streaming for such a long time because as a big music listener, music fan, I didn't really think about the fact that people aren't like us. Well, like me, where like, tuned into new music and making playlists make monthly playlists and our radio show, doing all these different things. It didn't occur to me that people don't have that same sort of listening until I dealt with other folks and realized to a different degree that they just don't. And so I think it's true that the algorithmic pestle of like this sort of like slop that we create musically, people just care about the sound. They don't remember artist names. I have a hard time remembering artist names because everything sounds the same.
Right.
If they're not like somebody that's prominently in my mind, or it's not a whole record that I like, I'm often having to go back and go, wait, who is that? Because so much stuff these days really sounds like the other thing. And I think that is definitely something that would not have been true even 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I want to break it down a little bit just so that it's clear to folks who haven't read this book yet. Like, the reason that it all sounds the same is purposeful. Spotify designed this stuff to sound the same, or designed the mechanisms for how people create music. Because basically what Spotify did was, when they started focusing all of the navigation and all of the content serving around these mood-based playlists like Study Focus and Chill Vibes and Dinner Party, whatever, they would have these curators at first on staff that were picking stuff. And like, actually, I don't have a problem with that. Like, that's kind of cool. You get good curators, like, you get cool music together. But as they realized that they were spending outsized amounts of money on royalties to actual artists, labels anyway, they thought, well, how can we reduce those payments? And so they would look at what music was getting the most amount of streams and which playlists were getting the most amount of streams. And they would say, okay, that's doing well. This is too expensive. Let's commission cheaper music by fake bands, essentially, by, they called it perfect fit content. Let's commission music that kind of sounds like this and fits into the vibe. And because most of our listeners, we know, aren't actively listening to this stuff, we'll just toss those songs in. Cost us less money. They probably won't notice. Hint, some of them noticed. But, all of this was around trying to reduce their costs. But at the same time, what they ended up doing was similar to Muzak. They started basically controlling the listening patterns of the people listening to it. So like, Muzak would program functional music that would make regular listeners then choose Muzak, and that's essentially what Spotify has done too. They have shaped these playlists and moods and the preferences of their listeners to certain playlists and moods to the point where they can just insert whatever they want, and people don't really know the difference. And so you do end up having those playlists where everything just sounds the same, and it doesn't really matter who the artist is because it is about the vibes.
You talk about the curation piece and the getting rid of the curators, and it's really interesting because so much of this creation of fake everything. I think that we won't get into it in this show, but there's a broader critique around society and how we've delegate these things to algorithms or to agents. Where we say, okay, well, I got a lot going on and I just want to hear something right now. I'm just going to delegate that to the robot and let it pick me a song. I'm really stressed out, man. We just ask the robot to tell me what time it is, or to order some food for me because I don't have time for that. And over time, you don't know what you like. It's too much work cognitively to figure out what kind of paper towels to buy. I'm just going to let the machine figure it out for me. But this is where we get into Ron does critical theory, and this is not what you are listening to. So I won't do that to you right now, but someday I will.
Well, I think you're right, Ron, like 100% right. And I think it's important to talk about the danger of all this, right? Because what do you lose? And Liz Pelly she pulls out some of my favorite critical thinkers from my media studies days, brings up some Walter Benjamin, and one of his more famous essays is on aura, and how when you take art or you take a work and you take it out of its context and you continue to reproduce it in different ways away from its actual natural context, it loses its aura. It loses the actual value that's there. Or like in our case, we want to simplify, it loses its artistic merit, right? And I mean, that's really what's at stake here with music. I think we've had these conversations in the design world with, it'd be like, oh, you're commodifying design. Canva comes out and you no longer have to know how to use Photoshop, or whatever else, to the point where now it's like, well, you can just put a prompt into Midjourney and you don't need to know how to take a photo, or you don't need to know how to do any sort of photo manipulation or whatever. It's kind of the same here. And the larger questions do abound. Like, at what point do we just ignore art entirely, where we don't place any value on it? We don't fund it, as a society. All these things we actually see happening, honestly. And what does that do to us as people? What does that do to us as a society? That's the thing that scares me the most.
You've given me on several threads, but I want to double back to your Walter Benjamin mention. Joel, what year did he talk about the aura? What year did he write about that? 1936.
It's
he was
36.
writing about that in 1936. That just breaks your brain to think about. And obviously the lineage to McLuhan but thinking about, I'm a big fan of Nam June Paik, who was a visual artist and theorist who really did a lot of really neat things you should look up. But 1936, he's talking about this idea that I'm going to deviate slightly here and talk about how, when radio first came out, people who made recorded music got really upset about the fact that radio was going to stop live performers from making money. The reason royalties exist is because the government had to figure out a way to get live artists their money, because recorded music was still a new thing. Radio was still a new thing. And so it's wild that here we are 100 years later. And now what we're discussing is guys like the CEO of an AI, LOL, music app called Suno, who a few months ago said, nobody likes making music anyway. It's really hard to make music. And who's got time for that? I don't know. Yeah. People don't want to do that. So why wouldn't we just let my sloppy ass app do it? Because come on, let's be real. Music classes, haha, am I right?
Yeah. And it goes back to what you said earlier around craft, right? And it's not everyone cares about craft. And I don't know that that's fine, but it's a reality. I wrote the theme music for this podcast and it sucked. It was mostly not fun doing it. It took a long time to get to the fun parts. And that's because I don't feel that I'm as good of a musician as I should be. And that sometimes I can't get the ideas that are in my head out through my fingers into the keyboard or into the guitar or onto the bass or whatever. And that's important. Putting work and time and craft into creating something is valuable. There's value in so many different areas. And when we do just outsource all of those things, we don't just lose the value of the work that we're creating. We just kind of lose our value as humans because we don't know how to do anything at that point. If we don't know how to do anything, what stops other people from just doing everything over the top of us?
I go to a lot of shows, as you know, but this year has been weird because I would say I go to a lot of shows, but a friend's son is in a jazz band at a high school not far from here, just over the border in Washington State. And I've gone to a few of his band's jazz shows. And it really is one, it takes me back to being in high school myself and being in, concert band, jazz band, and all of that. I played baritone and horn. Was not as good at playing baritone as this young man is playing a trumpet. No, and his peers are playing their instruments. But it still feels so good to me to see kids connecting to music. I joke that a lot of them playing just jazz. And I'm like, they haven't been hurt enough yet to understand how to really play jazz music, right? Like it sounds technically good, but they haven't been,
Yeah.
jazz, you got to grow up to feel it. But nonetheless, they're really, really technically absurdly good. And I just think in a world where, people like us who spend a lot of time reading about and thinking about all this stuff with AI and all these things, even them, probably GPT and God knows what, but seeing them on that horn or on that piano or on that drums and seeing them just killing it gives me so much hope for, okay, it's gonna be different, but maybe
Yeah.
we're still clinging to something in this because it's not all doom and gloom. This is the most positive part of this whole podcast. Don't get excited. It's not going to persist, but this is a positive moment that I'm giving you. Be grateful. And so, but seeing the kids doing that really has been validating for me to know that, you know what?
Yeah.
Things are bad, but not everything is as bad as I think it is when I read all the dystopian stuff I read.
So to me, there's two big dangers that Liz brings up in this book. I think the art one that we just talked about is one of it's the more existential ones. It's the one that's I don't know if there's answers to it. Like it's just to your point, we got to keep kids connecting with instruments and got to try to as people that value craft and value music, try to get other people to do it at the same time. I think the other thing that is somewhat related is just the fact that Spotify's methods have devalued the artists that do exist. They're not being paid for the work that they're doing. They're, back to your talk about royalties, right? Like the only place that they really can make money is out on the road because they get paid less than a penny per stream on Spotify and on most of these platforms. There are a few that do better. Tidal pays the most in royalties. Apple Music, I believe, is still second place, though Apple's not doing much better than Spotify in terms of fake music and that sort of thing. But Spotify is, as far as I know, the worst in terms of how much they actually pay the artists. And there aren't enough humans subscribing and enough time for humans to listen to that music to change that, to make it so that these artists who feel like they have to rely on Spotify for marketing, but don't actually get paid off of the Spotify side of things, the vast majority of them can't afford rent. They can't afford to have even just a comfortable, relatively stress-free life as professional musicians. And so, I mean, you and I, like, you go to way more live shows than I do right now. Part of that's because you live in a better city for it at the moment. But, whenever I go to live shows, like I make it a point to go to live shows of bands that I support or bands that I stream on Apple Music. I make it a point to buy their record, whether that's at the local record store or it's ordering from their website or it's going to a show. There's something about live music that, one, I think is just viscerally very helpful to connect back to the art of what's going on, but it's also the best way to try to offset some of the damage that streaming is doing to these people's livelihoods.
We talked a lot about the fake artists. I want to note that several things. One, that Spotify vehemently denies ever creating fake artists and putting them on Spotify playlists, which to me feels like something a legal person would write to ensure that you're not admitting to the fact that fake artists probably exist on Spotify because they do. And it's because you didn't put them on a playlist doesn't mean they didn't somehow make it onto a playlist algorithmically. We didn't put them there. It just happened magically. But Spotify calls this PFC, or perfect fit content, which is, you put that in your dystopian vocab book for later when you need something else. But to your point, obviously going to a lot of shows, I didn't start collecting vinyl. You collected vinyl a lot longer than I did. And I'd come to your house and you'd put on some record and I was like, I should do that. But it always felt like too much work. And during the pandemic, I finally decided to kind of get into it. And now, because it's one way for me to give money to an artist without just only going to a show and getting show money or whatever, if I can buy a record from an artist, especially an artist that is like newer or up and coming, or an artist that is older, that I love the record of theirs and I want to have it in the archives. So that has been something that I've been doing more intentionally over the last couple of years than I had never done in the past. And it makes me feel pretty good. But I think it's a good way to, like you said, to sort of, and she talks about in the book, is a way to like buy direct from artists, like try to find artists that are on these indie labels and being able to support them to support artists. And so I've been very more intentional about that. There are a lot of these reissue labels that I tend to like that put out stuff for things that, old music that I like, but the artist is still alive. And so I don't know that as humans, as people ourselves, that, we have to own our own decisions, but I think that this is much bigger than all of us. And so I don't think there's any shame in just sitting down and listening to some tunes when you can. I think this book has been helpful for thinking about how gamified all this is, how rigged the game is, and how even though you think your taste is, I'm refined, I listen to whatever. In reality, so much of this being shaped by the fact that 85% of music right now is streaming, which is, if you're over 30, that was not your existence as a child or a teenager. So it's wild to think about that. So Joel, I know we this book has been really cool for us because it allows us to talk about music and algorithms and in the AI slop era, two things that we're both really passionate about. The perfect Venn diagram of our interests right now. Like this book was perfectly timed for where our heads are right now. But I do want to, I guess I said there was one positive part of this podcast. I'm going to give you another positive thing. Joel, what's one like nostalgia that this book brought out for you in thinking about, I know shouts of yacht rock and all the old things that we used to care about in music, but is there anything that this book brought out for you in a nostalgia sense musically?
So in undergrad, the college I went to was very musically inclined, and I had a lot of friends that were in bands. I was going to be in bands and realized how much worse of a guitar player I was than everyone else there. So I did a lot more, monitor engineering, front end engineering for shows and stuff. And like pivotal during that time for me, early aughts, was the whole music blog culture that was going on. That was how you marketed yourself as a new and upcoming artist. Like you would try to get your single dropped on one of those sites, and then it would go crazy, and then like the bigger magazines like Pitchfork would pick it up, and then whatever else. And we had a couple friends that did that. One of our friends kind of made his career doing exactly that as a remix artist. And there's still a little bit of that going on, but I think the shift to streaming is really, it just, the findability stuff feels so less heavy without someone talking about, oh man, I found this cool band and they did all this stuff and here's the person and take a listen to the song. So I do really miss that. That's one of those things that I think was not just good for the artist, but I think for all of us that didn't maybe want to read commercial music journalism, like we didn't really care about what the big, Rolling Stone type of thing was, even Pitchfork, like their reviews were always terrible. At least for music I liked. But being able to read these blogs that were people that were just as, or maybe even a little bit more nerdy about music than you were, there's just something powerful about that.
The early 2000s you talk about was really an interesting time for me too, because it was a time for me to really get into like musical discovery in a way that, I'd always been a big interested in a lot of things, but I feel like that was a time that I made friends who got me into other things. I really got into hip hop because a friend, of course, a friend of both of ours, Josh, my college best friend, got me into hip hop, and he showed up and he's like, yo, Ron, do you like a blah, 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 blah? And he'd bring me a record and I'd listen to it. And then it turns out I liked that record and I would give him a record. He's never given me a bad rec. Talk about human curation. If he sends me something good, I know it's going to be good.
Yeah.
But I think you really touched on this thing about how so much of the old days, even really, like I said, not too long ago, where having that cosign or that recommendation from somebody allowed a thing to be better than it was. Even not that long ago, like, it's funny that I'm mentioning this guy because I look at any of his music, but Lil Nas X, he goes viral online, but it took a Billy Ray Cyrus cosign for his song to become the most streamed, number one hit ever, right? Like, that cosign is still really important. But you know who gives cosigns? Humans, not AI agents, not Spotify, not bots. And so the question is going to become, in the next iteration of music, right, where TikTok is still the dominant form of listening to music for a lot of the kids that are under 20, right? What's going to happen to that cosign? What is that going to look like? But I really miss I'm enjoying now that there's nostalgia for the blog era. I listen to a lot more rap than you do. And there's a lot of consistent nostalgia for what they call the blog era of rap. It's kind of like the 90s stuff where nobody ever called it that at the time, but now we call it that because it's been so long. And it turns out it was a moment in time.
Yeah.
And so I'm really enjoying it. And it's a certain sound that it's kind of like college radio. I say that to you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And
Yeah.
blog era rap is
Yep.
exactly the same thing. Someone listening right now would go, oh, damn, like, like early Lupe Fiasco. And you're like, yeah, exactly. Or like, whatever, like Shabazz Palaces or something. Like, it's really interesting to think about how that happens and how people who didn't grow up in that era really appreciate what we thought was
Yeah.
sort of just Tuesday for us. But now we're not going to ever have those moments back
Yeah.
again. And it's really interesting to think about what that does, how culture's been flattened so much in a relatively short period of time, and not really for the better. I would argue that
Yeah.
Audio Galaxy, RDIO, the blog era, all these things are improvements to our experiences. And I would say now that we're in this like declining era where things don't have that same excitement, that same value for us.
We've given up way more control over the things that we like and that our own tastes to algorithms than, I mean, maybe we were giving over parts of that, but at least it was real people, before. And now it's just being shaped by stuff that's like, the herd mentality around stuff that you like. And I think it's hard to be a true fan when you're not hearing new stuff at all. When you're not challenging the stuff that you want, it's hard to be a true fan of the bands that you do like, because everything just kind of sounds the same. But there is so much more in this book too. It felt longer, like reading through it. It was just jam packed with stuff. So I would say that I recommend anyone pick it up and read it, especially if you are interested in music and consider yourself a music fan. And even better if you are curious about all the algorithmic stuff that's happening in our world. But it's great. Book was Mood Machine by Liz Pelly. There's a link in our show notes to bookshop.org where you can buy it. We don't get any sort of money from that, but you do get to support local bookshops when you order through them and not Amazon. And more of that money goes directly to the authors. And so we're gonna keep hyping the bookshop links as long as we can. So go pick it up. Future Perfect Book Club is produced by Jessica Goodman. Our theme song is by Joel Goodman with drums from Mike Petroff. You can find us on the web and on Blue Sky at futureperfectbook.club.